General Marcus Taylor, returning from 2 years of military service, was eagerly heading home for a peaceful evening with his family. But a routine stop at the grocery store turned into a distressing ordeal when Officer Derek Winters, suspicious and aggressive, wrongly accused him of resisting arrest. Despite Marcus's calm demeanor and military ID, Winters' actions escalated the situation until Officer Jennifer Hayes intervened, revealing the gravity of the error. This shocking incident highlights a profound moment of injustice and the importance of recognizing the dignity of every individual. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. General Marcus Taylor's body ached with fatigue, but his mind was alert and vibrant, crackling with anticipation as he neared the end of his journey home. After 2 long years commanding military operations abroad, overseeing complex missions that stretched his strategic prowess and tested his endurance as a leader, he finally found himself approaching the sanctuary of his front door. This evening, however, the burdens of command felt momentarily lifted. The comforting familiarity of home was a soothing balm to his weary soul. It was late at night, with the sun long gone and the sky draped in a deep, velvety navy. The small suburban neighborhood where Marcus had spent countless peaceful days now lay tranquil under the gentle illumination of streetlights. This was a town he cherished deeply. It wasn't defined by the frenetic pulse of a metropolis, but rather by its serene charm. A picturesque landscape with tree-lined streets, meticulously maintained homes, and the occasional child's bicycle left casually on the curb. It stood in stark contrast to the harsh, unyielding environments of deserts and mountains where he had spent the past years, navigating conflict zones and making critical, life-altering decisions. Awaiting him at home was his wife, Cynthia. Earlier in the day, she had sent him a simple text reminder to pick up a few groceries before he arrived. It was a mundane task, almost surreal after months spent under the weight of military protocols and high-stakes briefings. Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude for this return to ordinary life. He had missed the simplicity of daily routines, the grocery store trips, the casual coffee breaks at the kitchen table, and the joyful sounds of his children playing in the backyard. As he drove down Main Street, he inhaled deeply, relishing the tranquil solitude of the night. The town was mostly asleep, its streets deserted save for a few parked cars and the occasional stray cat darting across the road. He eased his grip on the steering wheel and rolled down the window, allowing the cool night air to circulate through the car. The familiar scent of pine trees and damp earth brought with it a comforting reminder that, despite all that had changed, some constants remained. The radio played softly, a slow jazz melody that harmonized perfectly with the peaceful ambience of the night. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcus felt at ease. He was no longer General Taylor, a figure of military authority with thousands of lives resting on his decisions. In this moment, he was simply Marcus, husband, father, and neighbor. As he drove, his mind was flooded with vivid memories of his return. He recalled the heartwarming sight of his children rushing towards him at the airport, their tiny arms encircling him in a desperate embrace as if they feared he might vanish again. Cynthia's tearful smile as she held him close, whispering words of pride and love. These were the moments that made the sacrifices of his service worthwhile. Yet, he knew that adjusting from the battlefield to home life was not something that came easily, a transition for which the military offered little preparation. Tonight, however, those anxieties were nowhere to be found. Marcus felt grounded, ready to slip back into the comforting rhythms of everyday life. He took a left turn, heading toward the local grocery store on the edge of town. The parking lot was sparsely populated, with only a few scattered vehicles. The store itself was still open, its neon sign casting a soft glow against the enveloping darkness. He parked his car and turned off the engine, savoring the moment of silence before stepping out. As he approached the store, the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the sterile brightness of the interior greeted him. He grabbed a small cart and began to navigate the aisles with the same efficiency that had become second nature to him during his military career. Milk, bread, eggs, fresh fruit. His movements were deliberate and organized, his mind briefly reflecting on how delightfully uncomplicated this task was compared to orchestrating a supply chain for an entire battalion. As Marcus approached the checkout counter, he encountered the cashier, a young man who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. Despite his tired eyes and the faint lines of exhaustion etched on his face, the cashier managed a polite, albeit weary, smile. Marcus responded with a nod and a quiet "thank you" as he swiped his card and gathered his bags. It was a brief, mundane interaction, yet it held a comforting simplicity, serving as a small reminder of the routine that grounded him and made him feel at home. With his bags securely packed in the back seat of his car, Marcus slid into the driver's seat once again, his fingers tracing the well-worn contours of the steering wheel, a familiar sensation that always brought him comfort. He had just a few more minutes before he would be home, before he would see Cynthia waiting for him with that reassuring smile that had the power to make even the most challenging days seem manageable. As he drove back onto the main road, heading towards his neighborhood, the town appeared unusually serene. The only sounds were the occasional distant hum of a passing vehicle and the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. The tranquility of the scene began to relax Marcus, and his thoughts drifted to the weekend plans he and Cynthia had made: quality family time, barbecues, and perhaps a trip to the lake. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he imagined the joy of spending a few days free from responsibilities and the pressures of daily life. It was then that Marcus noticed something unusual: a faint glow of headlights appearing in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought little of it. It wasn't uncommon to see the occasional car in this area, but as he observed, the headlights remained persistently close behind him, and Marcus soon realized that it was a police car, its shape unmistakable even in the dim light of the evening. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. He raised an eyebrow but continued driving, making sure to adhere to the speed limit and avoid any actions that might draw attention. The patrol car remained uncomfortably close, and a nagging sense of discomfort began to tug at Marcus's gut. Nevertheless, he brushed aside the unease, reminding himself that he was a law-abiding citizen with nothing to worry about. That sense of calm was abruptly shattered when the patrol car's lights suddenly flashed red and blue, casting a vivid, alarming glow across the entire street behind him. Marcus's heart sank as he realized he was being pulled over. With a deep breath, he reminded himself to stay calm and composed, drawing upon his military training. His movements were automatic as he put the car in park and reached for his ID and registration, trying to remain steady despite the rising tension. As the officer approached his window, Marcus's mind raced through the familiar procedures: keep his hands on the wheel, avoid sudden movements, and maintain a calm demeanor. However, as the officer's silhouette grew nearer, Marcus sensed something was off. There was a palpable aggression in the officer's stride, an intensity that contrasted sharply with the peaceful quiet of the night. Marcus rolled down the window and offered a polite nod as the officer, whose name tag identified him as Officer Derek Winters, came into view. Winters's gaze was sharp and unyielding, and Marcus could feel an unsettling weight of judgment emanating from him, though he had no idea why. "License and registration," Winters demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus handed over his documents, speaking in a steady tone. "Here you go, officer. I'm General Marcus Taylor with the U.S. Army." Winters barely acknowledged his words, his eyes skimming over the documents before his expression grew darker. Without warning, Winters's tone took on an even more authoritative edge. "Step out of the vehicle." Confusion flashed through Marcus's mind, but his military discipline compelled him to comply. He exited the car slowly, raising his hands slightly to demonstrate that he posed no threat. "What's going on, officer?" "I've done nothing wrong," Marcus inquired, his voice tinged with bewilderment. Winters didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed Marcus's arm with a rough, forceful grip, propelling him against the hood of his car. The sudden, jarring movement caught Marcus off guard, and he felt the cold metal pressing against his chest. His own rapid, uneven breathing filled his ears, and a surge of anger and disbelief began to rise within him. "Stay still. You're under arrest for resisting." Marcus's mind raced, struggling to comprehend the accusation. Resisting? He hadn't even had a chance to react. The absurdity of the situation began to settle in. But before he could voice his protest, Winters had already twisted his arms behind his back and slapped handcuffs onto his wrists with a roughness that seemed entirely unnecessary. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, their murmurs and the soft hum of their phones recording the scene, creating an eerie soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Marcus could catch glimpses of their faces as he lay pressed against the cold, unyielding hood of his car. Some faces were etched with horror, their eyes wide and brimming with empathy, while others were marred by anger, their brows furrowed in indignation. A few onlookers seemed almost detached, observing with an unsettling curiosity. Despite the growing number of witnesses, none of them stepped forward to intervene or speak out. The silence was heavy and oppressive, and the scene continued to play out with a stark, uncomfortable clarity. Marcus's chest was painfully pressed against the icy metal of the car hood, his muscles straining under the relentless pressure of Officer Winters' grip. Winters forced his arms behind his back with merciless efficiency, and the handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp, biting finality that sent a jolt of cold metal against his skin. The sensation was more than physical. It was a brutal reminder of his loss of freedom and dignity. A wave of disbelief washed over him as the situation unraveled far quicker than his mind could process. Just moments before, he had been driving home, envisioning the warmth and safety of his house, only to find himself now restrained and treated as if he were a common criminal. The stark contrast between his peaceful anticipation and the harsh reality before him was jarring, leaving him reeling in a state of bewildered shock. Though Marcus had faced countless life-threatening moments during his military service, where every decision carried the weight of life and death, this situation was different. The immediate danger he faced wasn't from a known adversary, but from someone who was supposed to be a protector, an officer sworn to uphold the law and serve the public. The betrayal of trust was palpable, and the danger now came from an institution that had once promised safety and justice. Marcus's cheek pressed against the cold car hood felt like the world had turned surreal, like he was trapped in a distorted reality where his training and discipline seemed almost irrelevant. He struggled to calm his racing heart, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate the already tense situation. His military training urged him to remain still and composed, but beneath the surface, seething anger burned fiercely. As Marcus lay there, his mind drifted back to his years of dedicated service in the army. He recalled the respect he had earned through unwavering commitment and sacrifice, the countless moments where he had led soldiers with honor and courage. He had devoted his life to serving his country, commanding respect and trust from those around him. But now, at this moment, none of his achievements seemed to matter. To Officer Winters, he was not General Marcus Taylor, nor was he a man of honor. Instead, he was merely another black man, unjustly targeted and deemed guilty without cause. The profound sense of injustice and humiliation cut deep, eclipsing all the valor and service that had defined his identity. Winters's grip on Marcus's arm tightened as he yanked him into a standing position, spinning him around with a rough, almost vindictive force. Their eyes locked briefly, and in that fleeting exchange, Marcus saw nothing but contempt. Winters's gaze was devoid of empathy, a cold determination that turned Marcus into an object of scorn rather than a person deserving of respect. Winters seemed fixated on asserting his dominance, using his authority to manipulate the situation according to his harsh judgments. "Did you not hear me, General?" Winters spat the title with venom as if it were a personal affront. "I told you to step out of the vehicle. You took too long, so now you're resisting." The weight of Winters's words pressed down on Marcus, each syllable a reminder of the twisted reality he now faced. Resisting? Was this really what it had come to? All he had done was comply with instructions, maintaining a calm and respectful demeanor. There was no resistance in his actions, no defiance. But in this harsh reality, none of his behavior seemed to count for anything. From the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed the growing crowd of bystanders. Some stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and helplessness, while others fumbled with their phones, capturing the moment in shaky footage. The thought of being publicly scrutinized and the idea of this moment being immortalized in digital form added an extra layer of vulnerability and distress. The crowd's reaction was a stark reminder of how alone he felt in this harrowing experience, with his dignity and privacy on full display for all to see. The man in the crowd, a middle-aged figure with a baseball cap, raised his voice in frustration. "Hey, that's General Marcus Taylor. He's a hero. What the hell are you doing?" The plea for justice seemed to fall on deaf ears. Winters's focus remained singular, his demeanor cold and unyielding. He continued to treat Marcus as a mere inconvenience, his actions devoid of any hint of compassion. Winters shoved Marcus toward the squad car, pressing him harshly against the door before opening it with deliberate force. The officer's breath came in ragged, labored bursts, his readiness for a further confrontation palpable. Yet Marcus offered no resistance. He knew that the truth would eventually be revealed. He just hoped it wouldn't be too late to salvage any semblance of justice. As Winters prepared to push Marcus into the back seat of the squad car, the piercing wail of another siren cut through the tension. A second police cruiser arrived, its lights flashing before the siren abruptly ceased. The backup officer, a petite woman in her late 30s, stepped out with a decisive stride. Officer Jennifer Hayes had spent nearly a decade on the force, honing her instincts and developing a keen sense for when something felt wrong. As she approached, the palpable tension and the aggressive stance of Winters immediately set off alarm bells. Hayes's professional demeanor belied a deepening sense of unease as she took in the scene. Marcus, in handcuffs and looking increasingly vulnerable, stood by the squad car, while Winters's posture was aggressively confrontational. Hayes had been alerted only to provide backup, but now faced with the situation, the atmosphere felt fraught with an unsettling intensity. "Officer Winters," she called out, her voice maintaining a veneer of professionalism but tinged with urgency. "What's happening here?" Winters did not acknowledge her, his attention wholly consumed by Marcus. "We've got a situation here. Pulled this guy over, and he didn't cooperate. He's under arrest for resisting." Hayes's eyes flicked to Marcus, and recognition dawned. She connected the face before her with the images she had seen in news coverage and military profiles. The realization struck her deeply, filling her with a mix of disbelief and concern. "General Marcus Taylor?" she asked, her voice soft but unmistakably filled with recognition and concern. "Is that you?" Marcus turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers with a calm but weary determination. "Yes," he said simply, his voice steady despite the weight of the circumstances pressing down on him. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Winters stood frozen, the full weight of his actions crashing down upon him like a suffocating shroud. The name had been floating around in his mind, but only now did its significance truly sink in. His voice faltered as he uttered, "General?" The realization that he had assaulted a highly decorated U.S. Army general, the kind of man whose name commanded respect nationwide, settled over him like a leaden blanket, crushing him with its heaviness. His grip on Marcus loosened, his hands quivering uncontrollably as his mind scrambled to reconcile his actions with the gravity of the situation. He had just assaulted a general, a revered figure whose very presence carried the weight of honor and service. The enormity of his mistake hit him with the force of a tidal wave, shattering his earlier bravado. He took a staggering step back, as though distancing himself from the truth might somehow erase the damage he had inflicted. The crowd around them began to murmur, their voices growing louder and more urgent. Some shouted accusations at Winters, their outrage palpable, while others hastily recorded the scene on their phones, eager to capture the unfolding drama. Hayes, stepping into the fray with a commanding presence, placed herself firmly between Marcus and Winters. "Officer Winters," she said, her tone sharp yet controlled, "you need to step away from the general immediately." Winters stood there, his face draining of color as sweat began to bead on his forehead. He tried to speak, to offer some form of explanation or apology, but no words came. His mind was a blank slate, overwhelmed by the dawning realization that his career, and perhaps his entire life, had just plunged into a chasm from which recovery seemed impossible. Marcus, meanwhile, remained eerily calm despite the situation. His anger was a simmering force beneath his composed exterior, held in check by his deep well of self-discipline. The whispers of the crowd and the stares of onlookers barely registered in his consciousness. He had faced far more formidable adversities, survived brutal combat zones, endured the loss of comrades, and shouldered the heavy responsibilities of leadership. This was a different kind of battle, one he hadn't anticipated, but one he was determined to confront with dignity and grace. As Winters stumbled backward, his hands shaking uncontrollably, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone present, I didn't know. But it was too late. The damage was irreparable. The crowd's whispers grew louder, swelling into a cacophony of discontent. Hayes could already sense the brewing storm. People would talk, the video would spread, and the fallout would be inevitable. Turning to Marcus, Hayes offered a glance that mingled sympathy with professionalism. General Taylor, I deeply regret what has occurred here. We will address this matter and ensure it is resolved properly. Marcus gave a slight nod, his wrists still bound by the handcuffs, though his demeanor remained unshaken. It's not the first time I've been treated this way, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Hayes caught his words, and their weight pressed heavily upon her. Without a moment's hesitation, she reached for her radio, urgently summoning the sergeant to the scene. The gravity of the situation was beyond her capacity to handle alone, and every passing moment only exacerbated the impending fallout. The crowd continued to swell, more onlookers gathering to witness the unfolding spectacle. What had started as a singular incident had now become a powerful symbol of the systemic injustices that plagued society, a vivid illustration of how deep-seated prejudice and assumptions could erode the fabric of justice and respect. Amid the chaos, Marcus Taylor stood with an air of calm defiance, his composure a stark contrast to the tumultuous scene around him. Even as the world seemed to spiral into disorder, he remained an embodiment of strength and dignity. Officer Winters, meanwhile, stood in stunned silence, his body rigid and unmoving as if rooted to the ground. His mind continued to grapple with the enormity of his actions. The realization that the man he had so aggressively detained was not just any civilian but a distinguished U.S. Army general, a black leader whose name resonated across the nation, hit him with a devastating impact. The crowd, a mix of astonished bystanders and those already recording the scene, grew ever larger. The murmurs of discontent rose in volume, a palpable anger simmering beneath the surface. Marcus Taylor, though still restrained by the handcuffs, carried himself with a calm dignity that seemed at odds with the indignity he was enduring. He wasn't just a man who had been wrongfully accosted. He was a seasoned leader who had weathered far greater storms, and his steely resolve was evident in his composed demeanor. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of hurt and frustration. Officer Hayes, her face etched with concern and resolve, moved swiftly to Marcus's side. Having already called for backup, she knew that the arrival of the sergeant was just the beginning. The situation required immediate and decisive action to mitigate the escalating chaos. As she approached Marcus, she deftly removed the handcuffs from his wrists, her touch gentle and precise. "I'm truly sorry, General Taylor," Hayes said softly, her voice carrying a sincerity that Winters could never have mustered. This was an unfortunate mistake. The weight of her apology was palpable, a small gesture in the face of a monumental injustice. The metallic clatter of the handcuffs being released reverberated through the quiet night. Each sound a harsh reminder of the ordeal Marcus had just endured. As he rubbed his raw, bruised wrists, the cool, night air was a sharp contrast to the searing pain where the metal had pressed cruelly into his skin. He stood there for a moment, allowing the chill to offer some relief, while his eyes scanned the crowd that had gathered. Their murmurs, once a distant hum, had crescendoed into a cacophony of outrage and despair. It was as though their collective pain and frustration had manifested into a tangible force, a powerful testament to their shared experience of witnessing yet another unjust act against a black man. The voices of the crowd were not just expressions of anger. They were the echoes of countless stories of mistreatment, a chorus of every person who had felt the sting of racial injustice and had watched in helpless fury as it repeated itself yet again. "Is that General Marcus Taylor?" A woman's voice pierced the din, her tone trembling with disbelief and a deep, piercing sorrow. Her question was not just about confirming the identity of the man before them. It was a cry of anguish, a desperate attempt to reconcile the image of the man she had seen in heroic roles on television with the cruel reality of his current predicament. The man who's been on TV? The one who fought for this country? The question lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of betrayed trust and shattered ideals. "Yeah, that's him," came the response from another onlooker, his phone held high as he recorded the moment, a symbol of modern voyeurism that clashed with the gravity of the scene. His voice was tinged with incredulity, underscoring the absurdity and injustice of the situation. "That's the guy, and they've got him in handcuffs. Ain't that something?" The incredulity in his voice was matched by a profound sadness, a realization that a man who had given so much, who had stood as a pillar of strength and service, was now subjected to this humiliating treatment. The crowd's anger was no longer a mere reaction. It had become an almost palpable entity, a seething mass of emotion that radiated outward, pressing against Officer Hayes like an oppressive heat. She could feel the collective disapproval and fury, a potent reminder of the deep-seated frustrations that had been simmering beneath the surface. Hayes glanced back at Winters, who stood frozen, his face ashen and etched with the stark realization of the enormity of his mistake. His eyes, once brimming with self-assuredness, now reflected a haunting, dawning comprehension of the gravity of his actions. He seemed a mere shadow of the confident figure he had been moments before, grappling with the magnitude of the consequences he now faced. I didn't know," Winters stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with a mix of fear and shame. The bravado that had once characterized his demeanor had evaporated, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. His admission was more than just an apology. It was a confession of ignorance and a painful acknowledgement of his failure to see beyond the surface. His words, fractured and uncertain, underscored his deep-seated remorse and the crushing weight of realizing that he had unjustly targeted someone far greater than he had imagined. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As Marcus finally turned to face Winters, his calm demeanor was a striking contrast to the intense emotions roiling within him. His gaze was steady, filled with a quiet but potent intensity that made Winters flinch. The silence between them was charged with a profound tension, a tangible barrier of unspoken words and unacknowledged guilt. The only sounds were the distant murmur of the crowd and the sporadic flashes of cameras, creating a backdrop of amplified reality that underscored the seriousness of the moment. "You didn't care who I was," Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that cut through the thick tension. His words were not just a critique of Winters' actions, but a profound statement on the broader issues of racial injustice. "Whether I was a general or not was irrelevant to you. All you saw was a black man, and that was all you needed to justify your actions." His voice was laden with the weight of a lifetime of service and sacrifice, now overshadowed by a moment of harsh, painful reality. His words reverberated with the collective disappointment of a community that had long been subjected to such injustices, amplifying the gravity of the situation. Winters swallowed hard, the weight of Marcus's words settling heavily on him like an inescapable shroud of shame. His face reddened as he grappled with the enormity of his actions, his internal struggle manifesting in his defeated posture. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words emerged. There was nothing he could say that would make amends for the wrong he had committed. The realization that his actions had not only disrespected a distinguished individual, but had also contributed to a broader, systemic problem of racial discrimination left him speechless and overwhelmed. Marcus took a deliberate step closer to Winters, his gaze unwavering and filled with a quiet, potent strength. "You don't know the first thing about me," he continued, his voice steady but imbued with a deep, resonant authority. I've dedicated my entire life to serving this country. I've led soldiers into battle, made critical decisions that impacted lives, and worked tirelessly to uphold the freedoms that people like you enjoy every day. And this is how I'm treated? This is the gratitude I receive? His words were a piercing indictment of the system that had failed him, an eloquent expression of his profound disillusionment and the deep sense of betrayal he felt. The impact of Marcus's words was immediate and profound. Winters felt himself shrinking, his sense of power and authority crumbling in the face of Marcus's righteous anger. His entire career had been built on the belief that his badge conferred an unquestionable power, but now that power seemed hollow and meaningless against the backdrop of Marcus's powerful testimony. The realization that his actions had been a glaring manifestation of a broader societal issue left him grappling with a deep, unsettling guilt. The crowd's restlessness grew into a boiling point, their collective frustration and anger now erupting into loud demands for justice. Voices rose in unison, each shout and call adding to the rising tide of discontent. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of urgency and a palpable need for change, underscoring the broader societal issues at play. "This is what we're talking about," someone shouted from the back, their voice a clarion call for action. "This is why we march. This is why we protest." The words were a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality, a collective cry for recognition and change. As the tension mounted, Officer Hayes knew they were on the brink of a volatile situation. She stepped between Marcus and Winters, her voice firm but calm as she sought to de-escalate the situation. "General Taylor," she began, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "I know you're deeply upset, and you have every right to be. But please, let us handle this." Marcus met her gaze, his eyes softening just a fraction. He recognized that she was not the source of the problem. Her intervention had mitigated Winters' mistake, but the broader issue of racial injustice remained. The damage was done, and it extended beyond him to encompass every individual who had suffered similar indignities. "I understand," Hayes said softly, lowering her gaze for a moment before looking back up with a renewed determination. "I will make sure this is handled appropriately." Before Marcus could respond, another police car arrived. A new development in the unfolding drama. Sergeant Daniels, an older man with graying hair and a stern, no-nonsense demeanor, emerged from the car. His eyes immediately took in the scene, assessing the situation with the practiced precision of someone who had witnessed many such moments in his long career. "Officer Hayes, report," Daniels commanded, his voice a mixture of authority and urgency as he approached. Hayes quickly explained the situation, her tone respectful yet urgent. She did not sugarcoat the facts. Winters had unjustly detained General Marcus Taylor, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and failed to grasp the severity of his actions. Daniel's expression hardened as he listened, his gaze briefly flickering to Winters, who stood off to the side, his posture defeated and his demeanor reflecting a deep, painful realization. The sergeant's jaw clenched tightly. It was evident that he was far from pleased with the unfolding events. "General Taylor," Daniels said, turning to Marcus with a respectful nod, "I deeply apologize for what happened here tonight. This is not how we conduct ourselves in this department, and I assure you there will be a thorough investigation into Officer Winters' conduct." Marcus stared at him, his expression inscrutable. "An investigation?" he repeated, his voice thick with skepticism. "How many investigations do people like me have to wait for? How many times have we heard this before?" Daniel's face tightened, his usual composure faltering for the first time. Marcus's words struck a chord that resonated far beyond this single incident. They spoke to a broader, systemic failure, a cycle of broken promises and unfulfilled reforms. The crowd surrounding them grew louder, their shouts rising in urgency. The tension in the air was palpable, transforming this moment from a mere confrontation into a symbol of deeper, more pervasive issues. Every injustice endured, every protest fought, every life lost in the struggle for equality. Daniels turned to face the crowd, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Everyone, please," he called out, his voice firm yet pleading. "We're going to address this. I ask that you remain calm and allow us to do our jobs." But the crowd had moved past patience. Their collective roar was a chorus of disillusionment and demand for accountability that could no longer be ignored. Marcus stood resolute amidst the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the sea of angry, frustrated, and pained faces. He understood that this was no longer just about his wrongful detainment. It was about the larger fight for justice that affected everyone. Turning back to Daniels, Marcus's voice was steady and commanding. This can't be just another investigation. It has to be more than that. People need to see real change. Daniels nodded solemnly, his face reflecting the gravity of the moment. "You're right, General. I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." As Daniels spoke, Winters remained silent, his face ashen and his body trembling. He was acutely aware of the storm that was brewing, but nothing could truly prepare him for the inevitable public and personal reckoning that lay ahead. The crowd's anger was palpable, and Marcus's resolve was unwavering. Within hours, the video of General Marcus Taylor's wrongful detainment and the ensuing confrontation with Officer Winters had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across every social media platform. The footage, depicting the aggressive arrest and Taylor's stunned reaction, sparked an outpouring of outrage and disbelief. Hashtags like #GeneralTaylor, #JusticeForMarcus, and #RacistCop began trending globally, fueling a movement that gained momentum with astonishing speed. News outlets, both local and national, were quick to pick up the story. Prominent journalists, anchors, and commentators dissected the video frame by frame, scrutinizing the aggressive nature of Winters' actions, the visible shock in General Taylor's eyes, and Winters' growing realization of his catastrophic error. This incident was more than a case of police brutality. It was the story of a national hero being mistreated on American soil, a man who had dedicated his life to defending the very freedoms that were now being denied to him. The response was swift and widespread. Activists, public figures, and political leaders voiced their condemnation of Officer Winters' actions and called for immediate reform. Civil rights organizations seized the moment to amplify the fight against police misconduct, advocating for sweeping changes on both local and national levels. The town where the incident occurred was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters descended upon the police station, microphones in hand, demanding statements from officers, the department, and anyone connected to the story. Yet, amid the clamor for justice and the flood of media coverage, one voice was notably absent, that of General Marcus Taylor himself. In the hours following his release from custody, Taylor had returned home, seeking solace in the embrace of his family. Despite his physical freedom, the weight of the night's events bore down on him with a gravity he had never felt even during the most perilous military operations. When he stepped through the door, Cynthia, his wife, was there to meet him. Her eyes were wide with fear and concern, and as soon as he entered, she enveloped him in a tight embrace, as if trying to shield him from the world's harshness. "I saw the video, Marcus," she whispered into his chest, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't believe it. I can't believe they did that to you." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Marcus held Cynthia close, his hands running soothingly over her back as if trying to calm the storm within them both. He wasn't entirely sure who he was trying to comfort more, her or himself. The harsh reality of their situation seemed to pierce through every word he uttered. "It's okay, Sin," he murmured, his voice laden with a deep, sorrowful undertone. The words felt hollow, knowing full well that everything was far from okay. But in that fragile moment, surrounded by the chaos of their lives, he clung to the desperate hope that being together would offer some semblance of solace. Their teenagers, James and Maya, had been absorbed in their phones, their faces reflecting a complex blend of anger and confusion as they scrolled through the viral videos capturing their father's humiliating encounter with the police. James, the eldest at 16, was seething with frustration. His voice cracked with raw emotion as he confronted his father. "Dad, how could they do that to you? You're a freaking general. Don't they know who you are?" Marcus sighed deeply, the weight of his son's words pressing heavily on him. He sank into the couch, a deep weariness settling into his bones as he placed a steadying hand on James's shoulder. "It doesn't matter who I am, James," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the point. To people like that officer, I'm just another face, guilty simply because of how I look." The words tasted bitter, a stark reflection of the systemic injustices he had hoped he would never have to confront personally. Maya, his 14-year-old daughter, sat beside him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The pain in her gaze was almost palpable as she looked up at her father, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and helplessness. "But you didn't do anything wrong," she said softly. "Why does this keep happening?" Her question hung in the air, an indictment of the world's failings that Marcus couldn't easily answer. He had faced unimaginable horrors on the battlefield, negotiated peace, and led soldiers through dire conflicts. Yet this fight against the pervasive injustice at home felt infinitely more daunting. It wasn't just about him. It was about every black man and woman who had been dehumanized, profiled, or worse. The enormity of that realization weighed heavily on him, a burden that seemed almost too great to bear. Cynthia sat down beside Marcus, her hand finding him with a comforting squeeze. "Marcus, people are going to want to hear from you," she said gently, her voice steady yet filled with concern. "The world is watching. They need to hear your voice." Her words, though kind, felt like another weight added to his already heavy shoulders. He nodded slowly, the reality of her statement sinking in. His entire career had been about action, about leading through deeds rather than words. But now, his actions, unwittingly and unwillingly, had spoken for him, and the world was waiting for his response. For the next few days, Marcus chose silence even as the world around him erupted into a storm of reactions. Protests ignited across the country, not just in his town but in major cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. The footage of his arrest had become a rallying cry, fueling demonstrations against police brutality and systemic racism. Whether he wanted it or not, Marcus Taylor had become a symbol of a larger struggle. In his small town, the protests were intense and palpable. The streets outside the police station were a sea of angry faces and raised signs demanding justice. One sign read, "Accountability now," while another declared, "No one is above the law." The collective anger was a tangible force, the energy in the air crackling with an electric intensity. The marchers chanted slogans like "Black Lives Matter" and "No Justice, No Peace," their voices a powerful chorus echoing through the streets. But beneath the surface of these largely peaceful demonstrations, there was an undercurrent of tension, a simmering frustration that threatened to boil over at any moment. Inside the police station, chaos reigned. Officer Winters had been suspended without pay, pending an investigation, and the department scrambled to manage the growing crisis. Chief Arthur Collins, a middle-aged man accustomed to dealing with controversies, now faced an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Thrust into the spotlight, Collins found himself fielding relentless questions from reporters and community leaders, every word he uttered meticulously analyzed and dissected. During a press conference held on the second day after the incident, Chief Collins stood at the podium, his face etched with fatigue and stress. "This department takes these allegations very seriously," he said, his voice firm but weary. "We are conducting a full and thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Winters, and we will hold him accountable if misconduct is found." The promise of accountability, though intended to reassure, did little to soothe the mounting anger and demand for justice reverberating through the streets. The situation remained volatile, and the search for truth and resolution seemed as elusive as ever. The public's fury showed no sign of abating. The calls for accountability that had once seemed like hopeful promises now felt like cruel taunts. Time and again, the community had been subjected to the same disheartening pattern. Officers placed on administrative leave, investigations launched, and then, as the dust settled, a return to business as usual. The cycle of indignation and inaction had left people jaded and skeptical. When Winters attempted to defend his actions, claiming ignorance of Marcus Taylor's identity and insisting that it was a mere misunderstanding, the public's anger only intensified. The assertion of unawareness did nothing to quell the outrage. If anything, it only fueled it. Even those who had once been in his corner began to distance themselves. Fellow officers, who had initially rallied to his defense, now avoided him, unwilling to be associated with the man who had wrongfully arrested a celebrated American hero. Winter's life had plunged into a relentless nightmare. Protesters gathered outside his home day and night, their chants echoing demands for justice. His family, too, became the target of public scrutiny and scorn. The mounting pressure was unrelenting, transforming his once secure existence into a living hell. From being an officer of the law who wielded authority with impunity, he had become an object of vilification, alienated from both his community and his former colleagues. Days were spent in isolation, his apartment's curtains drawn tightly as he watched the news coverage that dissected every aspect of the protests and the growing calls for systemic reform. The relentless media attention and the barrage of condemnation made it painfully clear that his career in law enforcement was irrevocably over. More profoundly, Winters began to grapple with the moral implications of his actions. For the first time, he was forced to confront the deeply ingrained racism and bias that had influenced his decisions, a harsh reckoning with the prejudices he had never before questioned. Winters had never considered himself a racist. He had prided himself on being a good cop, someone who was committed to protecting and serving his community. But the world's reaction to his actions forced him to confront a painful truth. He had been part of the problem all along. His badge had granted him a misguided sense of infallibility, leading him to believe that he was always right. That misplaced confidence had brought him to this moment of public disgrace, where his life was unraveling before him. Meanwhile, Marcus Taylor remained silent, choosing to observe the unfolding chaos from the sanctuary of his home. He knew that eventually, he would need to address what had happened, but he was determined to do so on his terms. He wanted his voice to carry the weight of not only his own experience, but also the collective experiences of every Black individual who had suffered mistreatment by the system. The world awaited his statement, and when he chose to speak, it would be a moment that would resonate far beyond the immediate crisis. In the solitude of his small, dimly lit apartment, Garrick Winters sat with a haunted look, staring at the flickering television screen. The news anchor's voice droned on, detailing the ongoing protests, the public outrage, and the mounting demands for justice. The viral video of his detainment of General Marcus Taylor had upended his world in a matter of days, and Winters found himself at the epicenter of a storm he could neither control nor escape. His previously ordered life, where he had once felt confident in the righteousness of his actions, had disintegrated overnight. He had barely ventured outside his apartment since the incident. The constant presence of protesters outside, the relentless media scrutiny, and the hostile glares from neighbors had transformed even the simplest tasks, like taking out the trash, into daunting challenges. His phone buzzed incessantly with a stream of messages, some from old friends offering tepid support, others from strangers unleashing a torrent of vitriol. Each notification served as a stark reminder of the escalating fury directed at him. The messages were not merely angry rants. Some were explicit threats, warning him of violence, urging him to watch his back, or declaring that he deserved to die for his actions. The fear that had initially started as a creeping discomfort was now overwhelming, tightening around him like a noose. His badge, once a symbol of authority and power, now felt like an unbearable weight. It had brought him nothing but shame and regret, and he could no longer ignore the devastating consequences of his actions. Winters sat on his couch, feeling a profound sense of despair and isolation. His hands shook uncontrollably as he scrolled through his phone, each swipe revealing a new headline that seemed to cut deeper into his soul. Hero general mistreated in racially charged incident, racist cop targets Black general, and call for officer's resignation grows louder. It felt as if his name had been inscribed into the annals of public disgrace, forever linked with a grievous injustice he could scarcely comprehend. No matter how desperately he sought to rationalize his actions, the truth loomed over him like an unrelenting shadow, impossible to escape or deny. The memories of that fateful night replayed in his mind with harrowing clarity. He remembered the instant he had spotted Marcus Taylor's car, the unsettling sensation that something was amiss, and the reflexive, instinctive response that had seized him. In that critical moment, he hadn't allowed himself the decency to pause or question. His actions had been driven by an ingrained bias that saw Taylor not as an individual, but as a threat based solely on his skin color. He had acted with a chilling, automatic response that left no room for humanity or understanding. The weight of his mistake was crushing. "I didn't know," Winters muttered to himself over and over, trying in vain to ease the guilt that gnawed relentlessly at him. "I didn't know who he was." But even as he uttered these words, he felt a profound sense of self-deception. The problem wasn't his ignorance of Marcus Taylor's identity. It was the unfounded assumption that had led him to act. Winters knew, deep down, that his actions were born from a troubling preconception, a prejudice that reduced Marcus to a mere symbol of fear rather than recognizing him as a complex, human individual. Years of working in law enforcement, grappling with personal biases, and grappling with the systemic rot that had permeated the institution had conditioned Winters to accept and perpetuate these damaging beliefs. The truth of his complicity in this broken system was now glaringly obvious, leaving him sickened and repulsed. He had devoted his career to the belief that he was making a difference, that he was a protector of justice. Yet, the horrifying reality was that he had become a manifestation of the very system he had vowed to reform. A system that had instilled in him a tendency to view black men like Marcus Taylor as threats first and human beings second. The sound of a knock at his door jolted him from his anguished thoughts, causing his heart to race. The protests outside had fueled a growing paranoia about unexpected visitors. After a tense pause, a familiar voice called out, "Sergeant Arthur Daniels." "Winters, it's me. Open up." With a sense of dread, Winters reluctantly rose from the couch and opened the door. Sergeant Daniels stood there, his face etched with an unmistakable grimness, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and concern. The gravity of the situation was immediately apparent. This was not a casual visit. Daniels stepped into the apartment, taking in the disarray. Newspapers strewn across the floor, dishes piled haphazardly in the sink, and the television's monotone drone providing a stark backdrop to the chaos. Winters had never been particularly neat, but now the state of his apartment seemed to mirror the turmoil that had overtaken his life. "Jesus, Derek," Daniels muttered, his voice heavy with concern as he surveyed the mess. "You're falling apart." Winters didn't respond. He slumped back into his chair, his shoulders drooping under the weight of his despair. Daniels took a seat across from him, the air thick with the unspoken weight of the situation. The silence between them was suffused with an aching heaviness. "You know why I'm here," Daniels finally said after a long, uncomfortable pause. "This can't continue like this." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Winters' gaze remained fixed on the floor, unable to meet Daniels' eyes. He understood the gravity of the situation. The investigation into his actions was already underway, and he had no illusions about the likely outcome. His career was effectively over, but it was more than just the loss of his job that pained him. It was the shattering of his identity, the destruction of the beliefs he had held about himself and his role in law enforcement. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Winters said quietly, his voice breaking with the weight of his emotions. "I didn't know it would explode like this." Daniels exhaled sharply, his frustration and sadness palpable. "That's the thing, Derek. It's not just about you. This isn't a solitary mistake. This is about a deeply flawed system, and you've become a symbol of that systemic failure." Winters winced as the words landed heavily on him, the impact seeping into his very bones. He had clung to the hope that this was merely an isolated incident, that with a proper explanation, others would grasp his intentions. Yet, Daniels was right. This was far more than just one isolated event, and it was larger than him. He was entangled in a much darker reality, and no amount of rationalization could alter that fact. "I thought I was doing my job," Winters murmured, his voice barely audible, weighed down by the gravity of his realization. "I thought I was protecting people." Daniels leaned in, his face softening ever so slightly, though his eyes remained stern. "You might have believed that, but the reality is, you weren't protecting anyone that night. You weren't serving the community. Instead, You acted on a hasty judgment fueled by bias, and now we're all bearing the consequences." The tightness in Winter's throat grew unbearable. For years, he had reassured himself that he was different from the notorious bad cops who made headlines for their brutal actions and abuse of power. But now, the truth was dawning on him. He was more similar to them than he had ever wanted to acknowledge. Daniel sighed deeply, rubbing his hand over his face in frustration. "I need to be upfront with you, Derek. The department can't shield you from this. The protests, the media storm. It's all too overwhelming." Chief Daniels paced his office with anxious energy, the weight of national scrutiny pressing down on him like an oppressive shroud. He had anticipated the oncoming storm, but now that it had arrived, it was unrelenting. The public's outrage had reached a boiling point, and the demand for accountability reverberated through every news channel and social media platform. It wasn't just the public that was calling for answers. Internal pressure within the department was palpable. Daniels turned his attention back to Officer Derek Winters, whose once proud bearing had crumbled into a shadow of its former self. The officer's face was ashen. His posture slumped under the crushing weight of his predicament. "Winters," Daniels said, his voice heavy with a blend of disappointment and weariness. "The chief is under immense pressure, and it's not just from outside forces. This situation has escalated nationally. People are demanding accountability, and your name is at the forefront." Winters swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. He had braced himself for this moment, but hearing it articulated so starkly made it feel all the more real. His career, the very essence of his identity wrapped around his badge, was disintegrating before his eyes. "You've been suspended," Daniels continued, his tone a mix of regret and firmness. "And once the investigation concludes, you'll face formal termination. There's no escaping it. The department cannot afford to retain you." The words struck Winters like a brutal blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He had been expecting this, but the finality of it was suffocating. The career he had devoted himself to, the respect he had once earned, was now nothing but dust. Daniels stood, casting a long, penetrating look at Winters. "I know this isn't easy to hear," Daniels said, his voice softening with a hint of empathy, "but it's the truth. If you want my advice, you need to take a deep, introspective look at yourself and understand how you ended up here. This isn't solely about one mistake, Derek. It's about the entire path that led you to this point." Winters nodded vacantly, unable to muster a response. He felt hollow, as though everything he had believed about himself had been stripped away, leaving him with nothing but the stark, unyielding reality. He had failed. Failed as a cop, failed as a person, and now he had to confront that truth. Daniels moved toward the door but paused, casting one final glance back at Winters. "Look, I know you've messed up, but it's not too late to try and make amends. You need to own this, Derek. The world is watching, and you have a choice to make. You can either strive to do better or allow this to define you for the rest of your life." With that, Daniels exited, closing the door behind him. Winters was left alone in the oppressive silence of his office, the weight of Daniels' words pressing down on him like a physical burden. Never before had he felt so lost, so utterly adrift. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, as the relentless images of that night replayed in his mind like an unending loop. He could still vividly recall the fateful decision to stop Marcus, the way his actions had spiraled out of control, and the escalating aggression that had quickly turned into a confrontation. The memory of Marcus' shocked expression as he was roughly slammed against the car was a scene Winters could not escape. For the first time, Winters allowed himself to confront the full weight of his actions. He had been in the wrong. There was no rationalizing, no excuse. His actions had been driven by a dangerous mix of bias, fear, and the unchecked authority bestowed upon him by his badge. And now, he was facing the inevitable consequences. But the repercussions extended far beyond his own shattered life. Marcus Taylor had been unjustly detained, his dignity stripped away in full view of the public. Winters was tormented by the thought of how a man of such high respect, who had dedicated his life to serving his country, could be demeaned and treated as a criminal solely because of his skin color. The guilt was a relentless torment, gnawing away at him. Daniel's words resonated deeply in his mind. He faced a critical choice: to let this monumental mistake define him or to make amends, however daunting it seemed. Winters recognized that he could no longer evade the reality of his actions. Throughout his career, he had seen himself as a protector, a man of honor. Now, he had to confront the painful truth. He had failed in every respect. Yet, there was a faint glimmer of hope that perhaps it wasn't too late to seek redemption. With a heavy, resigned sigh, Winters rose from his seat and walked over to the window. Outside, the muffled sounds of protesters chanting echoed through the air, their voices united in a demand for justice and accountability. He stood there for a long while, absorbing the weight of their demands. This struggle was not about him. It was about a flawed system he had been complicit in. For the first time in his life, Winters grasped the true significance of their fight. The day of the confrontation had arrived. Winters had dreaded this moment for days, his mind plagued with anxious scenarios of how it might unfold, each one more harrowing than the last. A part of him longed to retreat, to avoid facing the man whose life he had upended. But there was no evading this responsibility any longer. The meeting was set to take place at the local police station, in a secluded room away from the chaos of reporters and protesters clamoring outside. Winters arrived early, his palms clammy and his heart racing. Despite rehearsing his apology countless times, the sterile gray room felt cold and impersonal, making his rehearsed words seem insignificant. As the reality of facing General Marcus Taylor approached, all his prepared speeches seemed to evaporate. The door creaked open, and Winters' breath caught in his throat. General Marcus Taylor entered the room with an imposing presence that seemed to fill every inch of space. The general didn't need a uniform or medals to command respect. His inherent dignity spoke volumes. His tall, commanding figure moved with a grace that starkly contrasted with the heavy tension that hung between them. Winters instinctively rose from his chair, his throat constricting as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Marcus' expression was inscrutable, his eyes calm yet piercing. A gaze so penetrating it seemed to cut straight through a person's soul. The silence that settled between them was thick and oppressive, laden with unspoken truths and the gravity of their shared history. Desperate to pierce through the suffocating quiet, Winters struggled to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. After a moment, Marcus made a small, deliberate gesture toward the chair across from him. With a simple nod, he signaled that they should take their seats. Winters complied, feeling as if he were a child summoned to the principal's office. He fidgeted nervously, his hands betraying his attempt to maintain composure. Marcus remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Winters with quiet but intense scrutiny. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, unspoken intensity. Then, with a measured grace, Marcus sat down, placing his hands on the table between them. His movements were controlled and deliberate, yet beneath his calm exterior, Winters could sense the storm brewing in his eyes. The awareness of this storm only made Winters feel smaller and more vulnerable. "I asked to meet with you," Marcus began, his voice steady yet low, "because there are things that need to be addressed. I believe you must hear them." Winters nodded quickly, his throat dry. Whether it was fear, respect, or a combination of both that held him silent, it was clear that Marcus was the one who needed to speak first. "I've spent a great deal of time reflecting on that night," Marcus continued, his gaze unwavering, locked onto Winters. "I've thought about how rapidly the situation escalated, about how you didn't give me a chance to explain myself, to speak. You saw me and decided before I could utter a single word." Winters swallowed hard, guilt twisting in his gut like a knife. The rehearsed apologies that had once seemed sufficient now felt utterly inadequate in the face of Marcus' raw words. "You didn't know who I was," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly, "but that's precisely the point. It shouldn't have mattered who I was, whether I was a general, a civilian, a father, or a husband. None of that should have factored into your decision. All you saw in that moment was a black man, and that alone was enough for you to deem me a threat." The weight of Marcus' words hit Winters with a force he hadn't anticipated. He had known this deep down, replaying the scene over and over in his mind, dissecting his actions. Yet hearing Marcus articulate it so bluntly made it an undeniable reality. There was no escaping the truth, no way to rationalize it away. I didn't know," Winters stammered, his voice trembling and weak. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I made a mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow, the word mistake hanging in the air like a challenge. A mistake is forgetting your keys or mixing up an appointment on your calendar. What happened that night was far more than a mere mistake. It was a choice fueled by bias, fear, and a lack of accountability. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Winters felt the weight of Marcus' words press down on him, a suffocating burden. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't intended for things to unfold as they did, but he knew any such defense would ring hollow. Marcus was right. This wasn't just a simple error. It was part of a systemic issue, and Winters had been complicit in it. "You don't know what it's like," Marcus continued, his voice steady but intensifying, "to live with the constant reality that no matter what you achieve, no matter how hard you work, no matter the titles you hold, there will always be individuals who see you as a threat solely because of the color of your skin." Winters felt a lump rise in his throat, an unfamiliar and unsettling sensation that threatened to choke him. He had never truly grasped what it meant to bear the relentless weight of living under the constant threat of dehumanization. A weight that bore down upon you with every glance, every assumption, every subtle act of prejudice. The harsh reality that someone could see him as less than human based solely on his skin color had never truly penetrated his consciousness until now. What made the realization sting even more was the painful truth that he had once been an enforcer of this very system of prejudice, a part of the mechanism that perpetuated such injustice. "I'm sorry," Winters whispered, his voice quivering as if it might break apart under the strain of his emotion. "I know that saying it can't change anything, but please know that I am genuinely sorry." The words felt inadequate, pitifully small in the face of the enormity of the pain he had caused, but they were the best he could offer in this moment of deep self-awareness and regret. Marcus looked at Winters, his gaze softened by a mixture of weary empathy and guarded skepticism. "Sorry is a start," he said softly, his tone carrying a weight of profound sorrow. "But it isn't nearly enough. It can't be enough. This issue transcends the personal. It's about a deeply flawed system that perpetuates these injustices time and time again. It's about the countless black men and women who have been unfairly branded as criminals before they've had the chance to prove their humanity. It's about those who lack the privilege of a title, a platform, or a voice loud enough to cut through the silence of systemic oppression." The gravity of Marcus's words settled heavily over Winters. He felt his head droop into his hands, the sheer weight of his realization almost too much to bear. His apology, though sincere, seemed like a mere drop in an ocean of systemic injustice. The problem was vast and complex, far beyond the scope of a single apology or even a series of good intentions. Winters understood now that the injustice he had perpetuated was a symptom of a much larger, deeply entrenched system, and no single act of contrition could undo the damage or restore the dignity that had been so ruthlessly stripped away. "I didn't realize," Winters murmured, his voice barely audible, laden with a deep sense of despair and newfound awareness. "I didn't realize how profoundly this issue runs through the fabric of our society." His words were almost a lament, a painful admission of his ignorance and the profound depth of his misunderstanding. Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving Winters' face, a look of quiet resignation mixed with a trace of hope. "That's the crux of the issue, isn't it? Too many people either don't see the full extent of this problem or choose to remain willfully blind. They live in their own insulated worlds, clinging to the comforting illusion that the system benefits everyone equally. But the truth is far darker. The reality is that individuals like me are forced to navigate a world where our very existence is seen as a potential threat. We are perpetually on guard, constantly aware that our presence alone might be misinterpreted as a danger." The weight of Marcus's words was almost tangible, pressing down on Winters and enveloping him in a suffocating blanket of guilt and understanding. Winters felt a profound shame not just for the specific wrongs he had committed, but for the years he had spent oblivious to the suffering that was so evident to others. It was a harsh awakening, and the realization cut deep. "I want to do better," Winters said, his voice thick with raw emotion and earnest resolve. "I'm not sure how to begin, but I want to make a real difference. I want to change." Marcus regarded him with a scrutinizing gaze, his expression a complex mix of caution and reluctant optimism. After a long, contemplative pause, he gave a slow, solemn nod. "That's a start," he acknowledged quietly, "but simply wanting to do better isn't sufficient on its own. True change requires more than good intentions. You must take deliberate, concrete actions. You need to confront the role you've played in perpetuating this unjust system and then commit yourself to actively working towards its dismantlement. This is not a matter of a quick fix or an overnight transformation. It's a lifelong dedication." Winters nodded, feeling the weight of Marcus's words penetrate deep into his core. He understood now that no apology or series of gestures could fully rectify the injustices or undo the systemic failures that had led them to this point. The road ahead would be long and arduous, requiring sustained effort and unwavering commitment. He would need to walk this path every day, confronting his complicity and striving to make a difference, no matter how challenging. As the room fell into a reflective silence, it no longer felt stifling but rather infused with a profound sense of mutual understanding. There was a shared acknowledgement of the depth of the issues at hand, and Winters recognized that he had only just begun to grasp the enormity of the journey ahead. This moment marked the first step in a long and challenging road toward redemption and change. When Marcus finally rose to his feet, signaling the end of their conversation, Winters stood as well, feeling a mix of uncertainty and resolve. There were no more words left to say, and he wasn't sure if there ever could be. Marcus gave him a nod, not one of forgiveness but of recognition and understanding. "Take this moment and truly learn from it," Marcus advised as he headed toward the door. "Don't let it be a fleeting experience. Use it to drive real change." Winters watched as Marcus left the room, the door closing softly behind him. He remained there, standing alone, staring at the now closed door. His heart was heavy with the weight of the knowledge that this was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey. He had committed a grievous mistake, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But now, for the first time, Winters understood the depth of his responsibility and the steps he needed to take. Outside, the crowd gathered at the community center had grown larger, a testament to the ongoing struggle and the collective call for justice. The scene unfolded with an unexpected gravity that left many breathless. What had begun as a modest assembly of local activists and concerned citizens had transformed into an immense national movement, pulsating with a fervor that could not be ignored. From every corner of the country, people had gathered, their voices rising in a unified chorus for justice. They held signs with powerful declarations, "Justice for all," "No more silence," and "We stand with General Taylor." The atmosphere was charged, a volatile mix of anger, hope, and anticipation that seemed to electrify the very air they breathed. Inside the community center, General Marcus Taylor stood by the window, his gaze locked onto the sea of people outside. Sunlight streamed through the glass, painting the floor with long, stretching shadows that seemed to mirror the length of his journey. Marcus could hardly believe how swiftly his life had been upended. Just days ago, he had been a private citizen, savoring the tranquility of civilian life after years of disciplined service. Now, he was thrust into the role of a national symbol, a living emblem of resistance against systemic injustice. The irony was almost poetic. He had dedicated his career to championing the principles of justice, fairness, and equality, only to find himself unfairly reduced to a stereotype by an officer and the very system he had spent his life defending. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes momentarily as if to brace himself for the weight of the moment. The speech he was about to deliver felt monumental, not because of its length or the intricacies of its content, but because of the profound significance it carried. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was voicing the anguish of countless others who had suffered similar indignities. He was standing up for those who had been unfairly targeted, who had faced prejudice, or who had endured the silent, unspoken pains of racial injustice. It was a voice for all those who had been silenced by fear or oppression. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Cynthia, his wife, standing in the doorway, her presence a beacon of calm amidst the storm. Her smile was gentle yet profound, a silent testament to her unwavering support. She had been his rock through this tempestuous time, her strength and understanding offering him solace. Looking at her, he felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude. Her steadfast support had been a lifeline, anchoring him through these turbulent days when everything seemed uncertain and overwhelming. "They're ready for you," Cynthia said, her voice carrying a tender encouragement. "It's time." Marcus nodded, his face softening with appreciation as he reached out to take her hand. "Thank you, Seawine," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Cynthia squeezed his hand firmly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of pride. "You've got this," she whispered, her words carrying the weight of countless nights spent supporting him through this ordeal. "You always have." He returned her smile with a look of deep gratitude before gently letting go of her hand and turning toward the door that led to the stage. The sound of the crowd outside crescendoed as he walked closer, a powerful reminder of the gravity of the moment. With each step, he felt the profound responsibility he was about to shoulder. It was a heavy burden, but it was one he was ready to embrace, knowing that the voice he was about to raise was not just his own, but that of a collective cry for justice. As he stepped through the door and onto the modest stage at the front of the community center, the crowd's roar of support washed over him like a wave. He paused, taking in the sight of the sea of faces before him. Thousands of eyes were fixed on him, their expressions a mosaic of hope, determination, and unspoken solidarity. This gathering was more than just a protest. It was a powerful demonstration of community unity and a shared demand for change. The cheers gradually faded as Marcus approached the microphone. The air around him hummed with palpable anticipation. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd as he gathered his thoughts. There was no turning back. This moment was a defining one. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice deep and resonant, carrying across the sea of faces. "I stand before you today not merely as a general, not simply as a leader, but as a man. A black man who, despite his lifelong dedication and service to this country, was treated like a criminal solely because of the color of his skin." His voice trembled with emotion, each word laden with the weight of his experience and the collective pain of those who had faced similar injustices. The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective response echoing with a sense of shared experience. The words Marcus spoke struck a profound chord with those who had either suffered from or witnessed similar injustices. "This isn't just about me," Marcus declared, his voice gaining strength with each syllable. "This is about every single person in this country who has faced mistreatment, disrespect, or dehumanization because of their race. It's about a system that permits such treatment to persist without challenge or consequence." Applause surged through the crowd, their support swelling like a tide. Marcus allowed the clamor to settle before he resumed speaking. "I have dedicated my life to serving this country," he said, his voice unwavering and firm. "I've led troops into battle, made pivotal decisions impacting lives, and poured everything I had into protecting the freedoms we all cherish. But the events of the other night have made it clear that the struggle isn't confined to foreign lands. It's right here, on our streets, within our communities." Marcus paused, his eyes meeting those of individuals in the front row, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces as he spoke the next words with measured intensity. "We stand at a pivotal moment," he said. "We have a choice before us, to ignore the injustices unfolding around us or to rise and demand a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come, for our children and our grandchildren." The crowd responded with another wave of applause and cheers, their energy infusing Marcus with renewed determination. "I'm not here to promise that the path ahead will be easy," he continued, his tone growing more somber. "We are confronting centuries of systemic racism against institutions engineered to keep us divided and oppressed. But from my years of service, I've learned that no significant battle is ever without its challenges. And this, my friends, is a battle worth fighting." The crowd's roar reverberated like thunder, their approval resonating through the air. Marcus felt a surge of emotion rises within him, yet he maintained his composure, aware that this moment transcended his personal experience. "I didn't seek to be in this position," Marcus said, his voice softening momentarily. "But now that I am, I will use my voice. I urge each of you to do the same. Real change doesn't come from the voice of one alone. It emerges when we all raise our voices in unison, demanding accountability from the system." He paused once more, allowing the gravity of his words to settle in, watching as the crowd absorbed the weight of his message. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "I want to speak directly to the law enforcement officers who are watching this," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of unwavering conviction. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're not pleading for you to be lenient with us. What we are demanding is that you see us as equals. We want you to respect us as human beings, to recognize our worth and humanity beyond the stereotypes and assumptions that cloud your judgment." As Marcus spoke, a powerful wave of solidarity swept through the crowd. It was clear that his words resonated deeply, not just with those in the audience, but with every Black man and woman who had ever felt invisible or unjustly targeted. Each person gathered there had their own story of feeling sidelined or misjudged, and Marcus's impassioned plea was a voice for them all. "This is a turning point in our nation's history," Marcus said, his voice rising with an intensity that seemed to capture the very essence of the moment. "We stand at a crossroads where we can either avert our gaze, remain silent, or we can rise and demand that this country finally uphold the ideals upon which it was founded: equality, justice, and freedom for everyone, regardless of race or background." The crowd erupted into a thunderous applause, their cheers echoing off the buildings and resonating through the streets. Marcus felt the overwhelming force of their collective energy, a sense of unity and purpose that was almost palpable. This was more than just a protest. It was the dawn of a movement, and Marcus could feel the first stirrings of change in the air. He took a step back from the microphone, allowing the applause to wash over him, feeling the weight of the support from every person present. As the noise gradually faded, Marcus leaned forward one final time, his voice brimming with a mix of hope and steely determination. "This fight is far from over," he declared, "but this is just the beginning. Together, we will forge ahead and achieve the justice we seek." The crowd's response was immediate and fervent. Marcus stepped away from the podium, his heart swelling with a profound sense of gratitude and resolve. Looking out over the sea of faces, each one reflecting a shared commitment to the cause, he realized that this was no longer just his struggle. It was a collective endeavor. As Marcus walked back toward the entrance of the community center, Cynthia was waiting for him with a radiant smile that conveyed both pride and affection. She enveloped him in a heartfelt embrace, her presence a comforting anchor amid the whirlwind of emotions. "You were incredible," she whispered into his ear, her voice trembling with emotion. Marcus held her close, feeling the warmth and support that radiated from her. "We have a long journey ahead," he replied quietly, his voice tinged with both weariness and determination. "I know," Cynthia said, pulling back to look him in the eyes with unwavering confidence. "But if anyone can lead us through this, it's you." Marcus glanced back at the crowd, still cheering, still filled with a palpable sense of hope and unity. For the first time since the traumatic events of that night, he felt a deep and abiding sense of purpose. The fight for justice was only beginning, and he was resolute in his commitment to lead this charge. Surrounded by those who stood firmly by his side, Marcus felt a surge of conviction. Change was not just a possibility, it was an impending reality. The movement he had helped ignite would not falter until justice was achieved, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. Months had passed since the night of Marcus Taylor's wrongful arrest, and what had begun as a local outcry had grown into a formidable national movement. The ripple effect of his story had mobilized communities across the country, sparking a widespread reckoning with the systemic issues that had been long neglected. The video of Marcus's arrest had become a potent symbol, representing a broader struggle for justice, not just for one individual, but for the inherent dignity and equality of all people. The community center, once a modest venue for routine events, had evolved into the beating heart of this transformative movement. It was now a sanctuary where people from all walks of life gathered week after week, not just to discuss strategies for reform, but to share their personal stories of hardship and injustice. The center had become a vibrant nexus of change, a place where the collective determination for justice thrived and grew stronger with each passing day. Inside the community center, Marcus Taylor sat alone in a quiet room, surrounded by a sea of documents spread meticulously across a large table. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the weight of his responsibilities. Marcus had been immersed in his work for hours on end, driven by a relentless sense of duty and urgency. He wasn't just a public figure. He was the heart and soul of the Coalition for Justice and Accountability, an organization that had surged into prominence following the recent protests. What had started as a modest group of dedicated volunteers and local leaders had blossomed into a nationwide movement, attracting a diverse coalition of lawyers, activists, educators, and even a few police officers. They were united by a common goal: to propose and implement meaningful reforms to a criminal justice system that had long been plagued by inequities and abuses. As Marcus leaned back in his chair, he rubbed his tired eyes, trying to stave off the fatigue that seemed to cling to him no matter how many hours of sleep he managed. The past months had been grueling, each day filled with meetings, speeches, and protests that had taken an emotional and physical toll. But the burden was one he bore with a fierce resolve. Each encounter, each passionate plea for justice, and every rally was a reminder of the gravity of their mission. This was not about addressing isolated incidents. It was about overhauling a deeply flawed system that had been broken for generations. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, signaling that it was nearly time for their next critical meeting. Today's agenda was particularly significant. They were set to discuss a new initiative aimed at instituting community oversight of the police department. This proposal, which had gained considerable momentum in recent weeks, sought to establish a civilian review board with the power to scrutinize cases of police misconduct. The goal was to foster transparency and accountability, ensuring that law enforcement acted fairly and without bias. For Marcus, this initiative was deeply personal. His own experiences highlighted the urgent need for the community to have a formal mechanism for holding police accountable. This wasn't about casting blame or punishing officers, but about ensuring that law enforcement served all citizens with integrity and fairness. Just as Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to leave the room, Cynthia appeared in the doorway, her presence a welcome contrast to the weighty silence. She offered a soft smile, her eyes reflecting warmth and encouragement. "You ready?" she asked, her voice imbued with genuine support. Marcus returned her smile, though it was tinged with the exhaustion of his efforts. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his voice carrying a mix of determination and weariness. Cynthia stepped closer, her pride evident in her gaze. "You've already done so much, Marcus. People are starting to listen. Real change is happening because of your efforts." Marcus sighed, the weariness momentarily giving way to a softer expression. "It's happening because of all of us," he said earnestly. "This isn't just my fight. It's a collective struggle." Cynthia reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently in a gesture of solidarity and reassurance. "I know, but you've been an inspiration. You've shown people that it's possible to stand up and make a meaningful difference." Marcus's heart swelled with gratitude at her unwavering support. "I'm just trying to do my part," he said, his voice filled with humility. Together, they walked out of the small room and into the larger hall, where a vibrant assembly of individuals had already gathered. The atmosphere in the hall was electric with conversation, a rich tapestry of voices blending, community members, activists, and leaders from various organizations. At the front of the room, a large banner proclaimed, "Justice, accountability, and reform. Together we can build a better future." Its bold letters were a testament to the collective aspiration that bound them all. As Marcus made his way to the front of the room, he was met with nods of approval and heartfelt handshakes. The sense of camaraderie and shared purpose was palpable. Marcus had become a revered figure within the movement, not because of any inherent authority, but because of his deep humility and steadfast commitment to the cause. Once everyone had settled into their seats, Marcus took his place at the podium. The room fell into a hush, the crowd's anticipation almost tangible. Marcus looked out over the sea of hopeful faces, feeling a surge of responsibility and resolve. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady and resonant, carrying the weight of countless hours of hard work and sacrifice. "We've made significant strides over the past few months, but our journey is far from over. What we are striving for is not mere reform. It is a profound transformation. We are fighting for a system that serves all of us equitably, not just a select few. Achieving that requires unwavering engagement, steadfast commitment, and relentless determination from every one of us." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy and enthusiasm a powerful reminder of the impact their collective efforts could have. The room was alive with a shared sense of purpose, and as Marcus spoke, he felt the weight of his commitment being mirrored by the collective resolve of those around him. "We've seen some victories," Marcus continued, his voice resonating with a mix of pride and resolve. "The police department here has agreed to adopt several of the changes we've proposed, including mandatory bias training and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. These are significant steps forward, monumental even, but we must remember, this is only the beginning. We cannot rest on these laurels." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 8 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. He took a moment to scan the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of as many people as possible. There was a profound connection in those fleeting glances, a silent understanding that transcended words. We have to ensure that these changes are not merely promises spoken into the air. They must be implemented, enforced, and continually scrutinized. It's going to take all of us, every single one of us, to stay vigilant and hold the system accountable. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, a sound that spoke volumes of their shared resolve. Marcus saw the unwavering determination etched into their faces. These were individuals who had fought for justice long before his ordeal had begun, and their commitment to the cause was as strong as ever. They were ready to continue the fight, undeterred by the challenges that lay ahead. "But there's more work to be done." Marcus's voice rose with an urgent intensity. "We cannot allow these changes to be confined to our city alone. They must ripple across the entire nation, into every city, every community. People everywhere deserve justice, they deserve accountability, and above all, they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The crowd responded with a ripple of applause, but Marcus was far from finished. He knew the weight of his next words needed to match the gravity of the moment. "I've had conversations with leaders from other cities," he said, his tone unwavering. "They're watching us closely. They're watching what we're doing here, and they're eager to follow our lead. We have a unique opportunity to set a national precedent, to demonstrate what real, meaningful reform looks like. But we must remain focused. We must continue to build this movement, to push relentlessly for change, because we know it won't come easily." Marcus allowed his words to linger in the air, letting their full impact resonate with the audience. The passion he saw in the crowd was palpable, a fiery determination that transcended mere policy changes or initiatives. This was about a profound transformation in the way justice was perceived, the way communities engaged with law enforcement, and the very essence of how the country viewed itself. He took a deep breath, his voice softening with a mixture of respect and gratitude. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who has been an integral part of this journey," Marcus said, his gaze shifting toward the back of the room. "Someone who has confronted their reflection and is striving to be part of the solution." A hush fell over the room as Marcus pointed toward Officer Derek Winters, who stood at the rear. The crowd's collective focus shifted to him, and a tense silence enveloped the space. Winters, now in plain clothes, appeared almost out of place, his once confident demeanor replaced by a profound sense of unease and introspection. "Officer Winters made a grievous mistake," Marcus acknowledged, his voice steady yet compassionate. "He's here today not because he was coerced, but because he genuinely wants to be part of the change we're advocating for. The room remained still, the tension palpable, but there was a perceptible shift in the atmosphere. Marcus's words carried significant weight, and the crowd respected him enough to listen. He has taken ownership of his actions, Marcus continued, and he has committed himself to learning, to listening, and to striving for improvement. That's what this movement stands for. It's about accountability, yes, but it's also about redemption. It's about proving that change is possible, even for those who have erred. Winters stood quietly, his face a mix of pallor and resolve. The past few months had been a journey of deep reflection for him. He had immersed himself in discussions with civil rights leaders, attended numerous meetings, and grappled with the consequences of his actions. Not only the harm inflicted on Marcus, but the broader impact on the community. Having resigned from the police force, he recognized that his presence in law enforcement was no longer appropriate. Yet, instead of retreating, he had dedicated himself to contributing to the cause of justice in any way he could. Redemption is within reach for all of us, Marcus declared, his gaze encompassing the room. But it demands more than mere words. It calls for action, humility, and the courage to face our own biases and mistakes. It requires us to engage in the difficult work necessary to make amends. A noticeable shift occurred within the crowd. The palpable tension began to dissipate as they absorbed Marcus's message. While skepticism and anger lingered, there was also a burgeoning belief in the possibility of change, both systemic and personal. I stand firmly on the side of accountability, Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. But I also believe in forgiveness. To move forward, whether as a community or as a nation, we must create room for both accountability and the growth potential. For a moment, the room fell into a contemplative silence, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the air. Gradually, the crowd's response began to manifest in applause. It was different from the earlier exuberant clamor. This applause was quieter and more reflective, acknowledging the nuanced nature of Marcus's message. It signaled an understanding of the need to balance justice with the opportunity for individual and collective transformation. As the applause grew, Marcus stepped back from the podium, a profound sense of accomplishment washing over him. While the struggle was far from over, and there remained much work to be done, this moment represented a significant stride forward. Looking out over the sea of faces united in the call for change, Marcus felt a surge of hope. The people were not only ready to continue the fight, they were prepared to forge a path toward a better future together. As we wrap up this eye-opening story, we've seen how a simple return home for General Marcus Taylor turned into a profound lesson on justice and dignity. This incident not only highlights the challenges of confronting prejudice, but also underscores the importance of remaining calm and composed in the face of injustice. What have you learned from this encounter? How can you apply these lessons in your own life? Share one insight or action you plan to take after watching this video in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you impactful stories and important discussions.